Welcome, everyone, to our annual Where Shall We Begin? Planning and Budgeting for the Coming Year. I think this is our fourth time offering this webinar, and we get to hear from different people every year. So I am excited for this particular webinar because we have a lot of built-in opportunities to hear from you all as well. So we'll be watching the chat. Please include questions as we go, and then we will have times where we pause and look at your questions, address them, and you will have opportunities to unmute as well. So first, before we go any further, we just wanted to acknowledge that the budgeting process and its implications on your program and staff, it can cause a lot of emotions, varying emotions to surface. And so something that our administrator PD advisory team wanted to make sure we acknowledge is this tension, because getting the numbers to work can be challenging, especially when there are real human consequences. So just to acknowledge that, if you're willing in the chat to share budgeting, that is thrown out there. This process comes to mind. What emotions surface for you? Feel free to share in the chat on this one. I'll give you a moment to add things and then I'll read some out if folks are watching the recording. But take another minute. Anything else come to mind? All right. Please keep it coming. A lot of anxiety is written in the chat, a bit of frustration, uncertainty, confusion, the pressure of having everything correct at that moment. Maybe I should know more than I do. So having that surface. And then on the flip side, someone writes, it always is a fun puzzle for me. I like to problem solve in new ways. So it's exciting. So you could be at different ends of the spectrum or somewhere in between or all of them at once, right? Someone else shares, too often we're already past the point of signed contract agreements before we get the actual award, so it can be stressful. Curiosity and caution. Yeah, there's also a lot of agreement happening in the chat as well to what folks are saying. So there's a lot that surfaces. So the administrator advisor team just wanted to acknowledge, like, yes, we're talking about budgeting today, but there's also all these other things that surface. And so it can be a hard conversation or a defeating conversation, or it can be an exciting conversation, but there are things that we are kind of wading through as we are in this process. So we are going to start with this welcome and kind of go over the agenda for the day. So we are going to turn it over to Jodi Versaw soon from MDE, and she will give a funding overview. And then we have a guest manager that's going to share specifically about Minneapolis ABE, his program, and his approach and his answers to some questions that we posed. And there will be, after each question, there will be time where we're going to turn to you and say, what else? What other things? And so we're hoping that it will be all of us networking together and sharing ideas throughout this time, because as I've learned, I've never been an administrator, but the little I've learned from just observing and watching and being around the administrator advisory team members is that every program is different. every budget is different, there's so many different constraints and whatnot. So the more ideas, the better. So we are hoping that you feel comfortable sharing some things. And then we'll wrap up and be on our way. So our objectives: to review the adult education funding basics, identifying data and information that can be useful in making programming and budget decisions, again, hearing from other folks and what they're doing, sharing some strategies and some guiding questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Jodi, who's going to give us an overview of ABE funding.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to virtually see you this afternoon. Good to be here with you. I think my intention or my task here is kind of twofold, and one is just to sort of review and make sure everybody understands the basics of our funding, both the federal funding and the state funding, and also share with you as much information as possible of sort of where we're at this point, looking forward towards next year. I'm grateful for the planners of this event. That I think it makes a lot of sense to start this session by acknowledging that these are really hard and difficult things. And I absolutely recognize that the timeline that we have for our funding creates a very frustrating situation in terms of having to budget before you have an actual award amount. So I just recognize that is really frustrating. And so I want to share from our state level as much data as possible, while also acknowledging that it's not enough data for you to have an exact amount. So that was our starting point. I'm going to, first of all, just touch on federal ABE funding. So you probably know that we do have federal funding that supports our statewide ABE system here in Minnesota. It is relatively small compared to the state funding. So we tend to focus a little bit more on state funding because that's the majority of your budgets. But I'll start with federal funding and just let you know that while there are many uncertainties about what is happening currently in our federal government. I think we're all aware of that. At this current moment, we don't have any information that would suggest anything other than the upcoming fiscal year's federal adult education funding will likely look the same as this year or potentially a slight increase. Now, could that change? Absolutely. Honestly, in any year, that could change. Every year, both at the federal and the state level, our legislators have to allocate funds. So in any year, it could change. I think this year, people are predicting perhaps, or there's less predictability this year. So could that change? Yes. But at this point, we encourage you to think of and plan for your federal adult education funding to be, or the total pot of funding for our state to be about the same or a little bit more next year. So as a reminder, actually, Lindsay, can you back one second? Thank you. We use contact hours to calculate how to distribute out that total pot of funding. There's a couple other things. We kind of shave off a couple of other small amounts for a couple of other things, but I won't get into those today. So what that means looking ahead towards next year, if we have about the same amount of money or a little bit more, and we're using contact hours to distribute it, we are anticipating a decrease in the federal contact hour rate. Just as a reminder, it is currently, this year, the federal contact hour rate is 93 cents. And I'll get into why we're expecting a decrease here in a second. So that's an overview of federal funding. Next, let's talk about state funding. So state funding we get a lot more. Your award of state funding is a lot bigger than your federal award, and it is somewhat more complicated in the way that it is distributed. So again, legislators at the state legislature this spring have to pass a budget, and in that budget, they have to allocate a total amount for state ABE funding. And then we use a formula. The formula is defined in state statute. We cannot change it unless state statute changes. And there's 4 different components that are used to calculate how we distribute that total pot of funding out to the field. So The biggest of those four factors, the biggest factor is contact hours. That sort of represents generally the largest part of your award, and in many cases, the largest part of your award. And also it's the piece of your award that is the most variable from year to year and that you all have the most sort of control over, right? So while there are those four components, we usually spend a lot of our time thinking and talking about contact hours and how that is going to affect the budget. So when we think about adult education funding for next year, so thinking about funding for 25-26 state adult funding, unless something changes in state statute, we can predict the total amount of state funding, the total pot, will be somewhere between level or up to a 3% increase. Careful readers will see my asterisk there, and I'll give you the asterisk on the next slide. But we'll start there as a starting point. So we're looking again at flat or between a 1 to 3% increase is possible or reasonable. When we distribute out that funding, when we figure out everybody's award, remember we are using contact hours from the previous year. So we are right now in the period of time where we're counting those contact hours that will be used to calculate next year's funding. Remember, the contact hours are calculated on a different year than the program year. So it's that May 1 to April 30th year. Those contact hours are what will be used to calculate next year's funding. And in general, when contact hours increase from one year to the next, there is a reduction or a decrease in the contact hour rate. So I did mention that briefly with the federal contact hour rate. We are looking at an increase in hours, and I'll give you more detail on that in a second. But because of the hours increasing, we can also anticipate a decrease in the state contact hour rate for this upcoming year. So again, just a reminder that the rate this year currently is $9.60 per hour. So we can expect that per hour rate will go down next year. I want to address my little asterisk on the previous slide. So I said that the total amount of state ABE funding will be between 0 to 3% greater. And I want to acknowledge that the reason that is true, the reason I can say that with confidence at this point is because of a change in state statute that happened in 2023. Now, ABE gets that state pot of ABE funding. We get growth every year equal to what the K-12 system gets. Oh, sorry, that is a total typo on that side. That should be up to 3%. Sorry about that. I think this is the last slide I made before the presentation today. Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Good job. That's an important one. Awesome. Okay. So statute says we can get an increase in the total pot of up to 3%. That change in statute happened because of advocacy work by Literacy Action Network, or LAN, which is your professional organization and the organization that advocates for ABE at the state legislature. So I just wanted to acknowledge that was a big win in 2023 for our system. And then, so the total amount will be 0 to 3% greater unless there is a change in state statute. So I also just want to acknowledge that currently LAN is continuing to do more advocacy with our state legislature, and there is a bill that is being authored and is being introduced in both the Senate and the House that would add an additional 10 million to the total for this upcoming year. So that would change all of this math significantly in a very positive way. And then the statute change that happened in 2023 would continue to be in effect. It would continue to increase from that bigger amount, 0 to 3% each year. So I just want to acknowledge that those things are true. Okay, let's talk about contact hours and where we are at. I wanted to give you a year-by-year comparison, although this graph is getting a little difficult because there's lots of lines on it now. So there's sort of a bunch of different relevant years. But I'll just talk this through really quickly. So if you look at the blue line, that is the last year before the pandemic that we had the last full year before the pandemic, which was 18-19. So that is sort of represents, that blue line represents the old normal. Then I didn't even put 1920 and 2021 on this graph because at this point that, hours dipped way down. They would be at the bottom. They'd be below the red line, but it's like too much visually. From there, you can see when you look at the red line, the black line, and the orange line, that's like what happened between 2021 and 2024. And it's a very clear increase year over year. The green line represents the current year that we are in, and that's why it ends in December, because we haven't finished that year yet. So you can see that we are still growing and getting back to pre-pandemic normals. We're getting to the point where this kind of a graph is not going to be as important anymore. I think we're getting back to more of a normal place where we can just compare hours year over year and not have such a change between years. So that's the hope. That's what this graph seems to show me at this point. So to focus a little bit more recently, an important comparison is to compare what was happening last year to what is currently happening this year. And I know we shared this on web chat too, so this probably isn't new news to many of you. But when you compare statewide, 8 months worth of hours from May to December in 23 to May to December of 24, we are showing, as you can see in the graph in the previous slide, we are continuing to grow as in contact hours as a state. So during that period of time, there was about a 10% increase in hours. So I encourage you to look at that same comparison in your consortium, in your program. And this is a visual representation of how to understand that and why it's important to compare your hours to the statewide hours. Basically, what this visual represents is that if we look at the prior year, if we consider what the number of hours last year to be 100%, so everybody has 100% last year, and then you compare that to this year, the scenario we are currently in, if you look at the blue column, statewide hours are growing. So last year there was 100%, this year 120%, for example. In that case, these two different consortia, Consortia A and Consortium B, can predict different things. So a consortium like the orange bar, Consortium A, that's growing more than the statewide average, can predict an increase. On the other hand, Consortium B, which is still growing, but not as much as the statewide average, can predict a decrease in funding. So I know I've been using this slide for several years now, and I think we're getting close to the point where we no longer need this slide, but I do think it is still relevant for this upcoming year to compare the rate of growth of hours in your consortium to the statewide rate of growth, which currently sits at about 10%. So now, having said all of that, I also just want to acknowledge quickly that there are some caveats. There are some reasons why everything that I just explained can end up being a little bit different in different individual circumstances. So if one or more of these caveats apply to you and your program, you want to be aware of that. So the first one on the next slide is the contact hour revenue growth cap. So I know some of you are painfully aware of this because you've hit it for a number of years in a row, and I know that is frustrating. Basically, the growth cap just means that of the 4 components in your award, one of those components is contact hour revenue. There is a cap on the growth of that component. It is not a cap on the growth of your total award. It's only a cap on that one component. Of course, from most grants, it's the largest component. But that amount can only grow 11% or $10,000, whichever is greater. So this is just something for you to know. Keep in mind, though, that we don't know the contact hour rate. So you cannot predict exactly how many hours would cause you to hit this cap. So I don't suggest that you try to limit programming or give up on accruing hours because you think you might hit the cap, because it's hard to predict exactly. So instead, you should know what your cap might be and whether or not it's possible you could hit it, but continue, everything you always do to try to accrue as many student hours as is, as represents success in or effective programming in your case. The next caveat or thing for you to be aware of is this other cap. This is a different cap and it operates differently. In a very few circumstances, you might be subject to both of these caps, but generally you would be subject to one or the other, and in some cases, neither. The gross revenue per contact hour cap is when your full award is calculated, all 4 components, when those are added together and then divided by the number of contact hours generated in the previous year, that number has to cannot exceed $30 per hour. If it does, then the award amount is just reduced to the number of hours times 30. Another note, this cap was $22 for many years. So this cap is defined in state statute. For many years, it was set at $22 per hour. And then again, from successful advocacy work by LAN, it was raised in 2023, which really, really helped us adjust as a system to the lower amount of contact hours that were caused by COVID. So that was definitely a win at the state legislature in 2023. A third caveat is just to remind you that what I am talking about and the formula that I am describing exists in state statute, and it applies specifically to how the total amount of state ABE aid gets divided out between currently 39 consortia. State statute is silent. Happens next. And I know some of you, in some cases, some of you work in consortia where that's it. You just have one fiscal agent, one entity, one provider, and that's fine. Then nothing else needs to happen. Some of you work in a consortium that has multiple providers. So the funds may be distributed out and divided out to different members within your consortium. Just a reminder that how that happens is not, state statute doesn't say anything about how that does or doesn't have to happen. So this is based on your local agreement. And you do have a little bit, you do have more wiggle room there if you need to make adjustments somewhat between providers. We can't make any adjustments at the state level of how we divide things out into consortia, but your agreement defines how that happens on the local level. So just a reminder of that. So those are all of my caveats. So a review of the basics of where funding is coming from, what it might look like next year, and then a few caveats. And then to wrap up, I just want to remind folks that the next your next opportunity to get an update on statewide hours and to learn more about the annual application, which is due on June 1st, as it always is every year. That next opportunity is our upcoming web chat on Wednesday, May 7th. So at that web chat, like we do every May, we will walk you through the annual grant application for this year if there are any changes. So we encourage you to be aware of that date, particularly if you are the manager of the fiscal agent entity in your consortium. This is a really important workshop for you to attend. So just a reminder on that. And then just a couple of resources. One is just a basic a document that goes over some of the basics that I talked through today, if you're really wanting to look back and learn some more about that. And then, excuse me, a link to the there's a public report on the MDE website where you can see your consortium's funding and every consortium's funding. And I know many of you are aware of that and checking that regularly, or as you need to, but I just want to make sure that you have that link and know that that information is out there publicly available. If you look at your consortium's award, your report at that link, and it is confusing, I will admit it is not formatted particularly well. It's not particularly reader friendly. If you have any questions about what those numbers mean, how the math works, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to talk it through with you. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it on.
All right. Are there any clarifying questions? Feel free to add those in the chat. And then if it's out of the scope of today's webinar, then we can just make a note of that. But are there any clarifying questions for Jodi? Yes, Eric.
I just want to say is that, for a lot of us that got capped this year for 11%, it doesn't necessarily, we might get the 11% next year, even if we don't grow, right? I mean, as long as the new contact hour rate, the new contact hour rate is more than 11% what we're getting this year for our contact hour rate.
Yeah, definitely. That is true. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, the way I would think of it is if you hit the cap this year, add 11%, that's your cap for next year. And how many contact hours that is, well, we're not sure. So
Okay.
yeah, yep, you are right, Eric.
Susan.
Hey, do we know like how soon the vote will happen on the bill for the increase in funding?
No, we don't. It's in the legislature. The legislature is scheduled to finish the session in May. So hopefully by then. Although I don't know if you've been following what's happening at the state legislature this session, it's pretty wild. So I think there's a reasonable prediction they might go to special session. So honestly, it could be as late as June.
Okay, it would have to pass the House and the Senate.
Right. So right now, I think the bill they're working to get it in committee. It would have to get a committee hearing, pass out of committee, make it to the floor, get passed in both the Senate and the House, and then get signed by the governor. So yeah, we're in the very beginning stages of that process. And there will not be a yes. There could be a no at any point.
Yeah.
But there won't be a yes until at least May, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, Jodi, for being here today. If you have any questions you think of, please add them into the chat, and we will, I'm sure we'll be able to answer them that way as well. So now we are going to hear from Kevin, and I'm so sorry, Kevin Gahagan. Is that how I say your last name? I've known you for my whole time in ABE. Kevin was my first supervisor. But he is our guest manager. He's also a member of the admin advisory team from Minneapolis Public Schools. So I will let him introduce himself.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here to share kind of how Minneapolis is looking at creating our budget for this year and kind of, I guess, overall my budgeting ethos. So to introduce myself, I've worked in ABE for pretty much my entire adult career, about 14 years with a 2-year stint outside of ABE. But I'm back with Minneapolis. I've been here for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was with Minnesota Literacy Council, now called Literacy Minnesota, for just over 10 years. I started as a volunteer. I became a staff teacher. I was a coordinator for a site where I was the only staff member and everybody else was a volunteer. I managed the sites for Literacy Minnesota for quite a few years. I ran SID for a while for them too, and now the program manager with Minneapolis Public Schools Adult Ed. So yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. So our first question, we'll have Kevin answer, and then we're going to open it up to anything that you all want to share as well. But the history or the inheritance of a budget can have a strong influence on how you initially approach any major budgeting decisions. Thinking back to when you first started in your current position, what challenges did inheriting a budget pose? What benefits?
That's a great question because I remember my thought of when I first got this job of looking at the budget was one of like, holy crap, this is complicated. How am I ever gonna understand all the ins and outs of these? That stuff takes time, right? I've been part of budgeting where, again, that's the only staff at a site of being handed a budget saying this is what you got to do to make it work, to developing your own budgets, to also then now trying to fit within like things like district protocols and the way budgets need to be laid out within the district. So it's always a challenge for that too. I say my general philosophy with budget planning is like it's a prioritization. It's us deciding what's important or needed to the program for next year and trying to lay out a commitment to those priorities. Because really all budget management is keeping the promise of the budget that you set. And most of the time with those inherited budgets, things have been considered in the past of the way things need to be laid out, either for like the systems that you live within, or for the priorities of the program, or for how the funding streams work. And really, to me, I think the biggest thing is getting away from those systems. If you're trying to change things, it's hard to do in a big system. But I'll talk about kind of breaking out of that mold in a bit. But really, like the first thing you should do with your budgets is think about what's your fixed costs, your variable costs, right? We unfortunately very rarely have an opportunity to renegotiate things like rent or utilities or anything like that. You kind of know what those expenses are going to be from the onset. But then you do have buckets that can be played with a little bit or adjusted. So really like covering your fixed costs, which we know in ABE, the biggest cost is salaries overall. And I would put that in the fixed costs, obviously. Um, but you want to go through those first before you can see what's left, right? And what you want to adjust. And I was kind of joking with everybody earlier is like the dirty secret about budget planning is so much of it is set, even as you sit down, right? Um, and then it's the questions of what needs to change with it if you have some big adjustments that need to happen. But I also think it's an opportunity to talk about what you want for the future, right? And I put an example of here of like thinking about what we could do now, like should I replace some of the aging tech that I have? Do you want to get yourself on a system where it's going to be really costly to replace every single computer in your program, especially if they're all outdated? But should I start getting in a cycle right now of replacing some of that, right? Or do I want to invest in staff time for new programming right now because I think this is somewhere that we really need to grow as a program? So those are all the kind of questions that you have going into a inherited budget of saying like, all right, what really can I affect and what can't I?
Thank you. So the first question, does anyone have any follow-up questions for Kevin? Questions, comments about how his approach in particular? Feel free to unmute or to add something in the chat. Again, wait time can help.
A teacher 7 seconds. Right?
I know, right? Folks might be typing, so please keep that coming. Another question a couple questions to throw in there are thinking of your own budget that you inherited. What additional challenges do you want to acknowledge? In addition to what Kevin was saying, what additional benefits would you want to highlight? Again, just thinking of this webinar as sharing with colleagues, we're all at different points, and comfortability with budgeting. So what else would you add to that question?
Carly
Mm.
says, does it feel like all costs are going up, including the fixed costs? Absolutely. I was just talking with my amazing office manager, Rosa, about like a ream of paper has gone up, or a box of paper has gone up $8 in the last few months per box, right? Not to mention salaries, right? We can talk about kind of salary schedules and negotiations and stuff too. But obviously those costs are going up as well too. It's definitely the newer challenge in ABE is how to respond to all those costs, because everything across the board is increasing significantly. Eggs, I thought that was going to be fixed. Eggs were going to be cheap.
Yeah, Kirsten, technology has become sort of a newer fixed cost that we might not previously have considered, but it gets more important and costly each year. It's hard to cut back on technology as it is on staffing.
Very true. It's integral to everything that we're doing.
Mhm. Teacher contracts are up for negotiation again, along with healthcare costs rising. Yes, an additional challenge is the benefits piece in a field where you have such a strong mix of full and part-time employees. So there's that challenge. And then there's the, yes, please address salary increases from Katrina. So I'll be quiet for a minute because I do not have anything to add, but if others or Kevin, if you want to jump in and add anything.
I feel Clark's comment about the mix of full-time and part-time too. We have contract teachers and hourly teachers within Minneapolis, and those hourly teachers aren't benefits eligible too. So it's definitely a mix of costs overall of who do I have to consider with benefits, while knowing that's not my entire staffing. And those benefit costs increasing significantly too. I think right now we're calculating fringe at something like 36% of salary, which is a lot. ESST is employee sick and save time. So that's new legislation that came out of COVID for those hourly workers or workers that aren't eligible for benefits, basically encouraging them to have the option to stay home, basically de-incentivizing coming to work sick, right? We don't want people to come to work sick. So that also means we need to be able to give them options so that if they are sick and want to stay home, they're also not missing out on income.
So I have a question, and maybe you already answered it. But so all of these rising costs with things that are fixed, then what? Like then what do you do next? With a fixed
It basically just means the variable costs get smaller and smaller, right? So again, back to that point of you have so many fixed costs even before you sit down to start up a budget. There's less and less room for trying to get creative about it. And as romantic as it seems to like blow up a budget and start it from scratch, that's really not the reality of things, right? You have obligations, you have employees and staffing that you want to cover. You want to make sure that the program is continuing at least at the current rate. So you have to commit to those things, and usually that means with rising costs that there's less money to move around or to actually be creative. Yeah, I want to talk about challenges with trying to start up programming and how that gets paid. Katrina asks, we are part of consortia. Do we receive one chunk of federal money and one chunk of state, or does our fiscal agent combine those into one payment? I know since we're the consortium manager for the Minneapolis region, we do combine both the federal contact hour and the state contact hour into one payment for our consortium members. So that's usually through, and Jodi, correct me if I'm wrong, that's in the award letter. Usually that is also outlined with the federal money that's included, correct?
So there would be an award letter to the fiscal agent that outlines, from our office, that outlines the total amount of state funding and the total amount of federal funding. And then what happens from there is based on local agreement. So yeah, Katrina, I think to answer your question, it would be that depends on how it works in your consortium. And you'd have to check with your consortium leadership to find that out.
So additional comments, questions, please keep them coming because we might have time to circle back, but I will bring the next question into the mix here. What predictions are you making for your FY26 funding, and what budgeting decisions are you making as a result of those predictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge with budgets, even though you might have a lot of those fixed costs, is the stuff that you're really trying to guess is what your revenue is going to look like next year, especially in adult ed and just the way that our funding works. Like, and kind of like what Jodi outlined before about the, you know, the relationship with contact hours of how we're doing as a consortium or as a program compared to the state. There's that kind of guessing game that's involved with it too. Personally, for us, trying to guess that contact hour reimbursement rate is always the toughest thing to do, right? You try to go off of that relationship of, well, we're above this, what the state's doing right now, so maybe we'll have an increase in revenue. But you also got to remember that we're comparing increases in hours compared to us trying to guess increases in funding, right? So, and that isn't a one-to-one thing, because if that contact hour reimbursement rate goes down, then that hour is worth less money than it was previously. So we have to guess at some point what we expect that rate to be to start the budget planning process, since that's our main revenue. Personally, for our program, because we're the fiscal agent for the consortium, one of the biggest things that we have to do is estimate consortium payments, right? And so not only is that us guessing what the reimbursement rate is, it's also guessing what our consortium members' hours are going to end up being, since that's the direct relation of we pay out those consortium members' hours at the rate. So that means that I have to go into SID and basically anticipate every single consortium member, how they're running ahead or behind this year compared to last, and guess that kind of ratio is going to move forward, right? That they're 10% up in hours, so I'm going to predict that they're going to end the year 10% up over in hours overall over last year. So we are anticipating a small revenue increase because we are running ahead of the state right now. We have some pretty significant student demand and wait lists that we're trying to respond to. And really the best way for me to use that increase in revenue right now is invest into staffing, because that only helps the program in its future endeavors. It meets the demand that we have right now too. So again, you're trying to invest in the sustainable setup that the state has kind of made with the funding. You want to be able to play into that and make sure that you're making your program healthy for years to come. That's some of the stuff, all the predictions, I guess, that go into us going into our budget planning time.
Thank you for sharing. So again, what questions, comments do you have for Kevin or for the group? And are there any other predictions and budgeting decisions that you want to share? And we can take a couple people. If you do want to unmute, if that's easier, please feel free. You can raise your hand or just unmute and let me know. Otherwise, if you're willing to share some thoughts in the chat as well, that would be awesome.
This is Karen from Mankato.
Karen.
I just wanted to say that when I put my comment in there about it being a puzzle and being exciting, I'm not trying to be wildly optimistic and say that budgeting is so much fun, I can't wait. I basically enjoy planning and I enjoy predicting, but there is a lot of uncertainty. One of the things that I like to explore is grant funding and partnerships. And I like to be talking to our partners a lot about where we're at with funding, being very transparent about where we're at with ABE state and federal funding, and then ask them flat out in our partnership, what do you see? What other things do you see that I could be doing to get funding through you, through grants, through partnerships, through whatever? I was wondering if you have any insights on that, Kevin, and could talk a little bit about some of your partnerships, and if you're getting grants, how are you doing it? Are you looking for big grants, small grants, any grants? Just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So one thing that we've been involved with is workplace literacy efforts of going into an employer's location, setting up a class there specifically for the employees of that organization, that company, to try to work on developing their literacy or language skills. And to be completely honest and transparent, we've started asking those employers to also help with, in some way, to help fund those positions if the numbers that they're approaching us with aren't towards that sustainable level for us to continue that program, right? We want to be able to invest in things like workplace literacy programs, but at the same time, with the funding structure of ABE, if it's not sustainable for us, it's not in our best interest to subsidize being able to offer those programs, right? So just being completely upfront with them and saying, hey, this is how our funding works. So if you need to make it happen for us, sorry, my walkie-talkie's going on. Apologize for that. No, that I'm more interested in trying to develop a partnership where people want to be able to invest in their own employees, because not only is it a commitment on their part, they're not looking to us as the sole provider of those things, right? And I'm sure many of us that have been in the field for a long time have got those questions of, hey, can you send a teacher to this location, my location, to be able to start a class, right? And that hard conversation of like, that doesn't make financial sense for us, so we can't possibly offer it. I think it's fair to be upfront about those things too, instead of us getting into a situation where we are having to subsidize it through our general operating funds. But that is the biggest challenge with that kind of system with the contact hour reimbursements, is that doesn't leave a lot of room for startup money, right? Like finding that money to get it sustainable is the biggest challenge for starting new programs. So grants are absolutely key to doing that. So you try to look for those opportunities where it makes the most sense. But it's always a challenging conversation to people understand how you operate and what they need to provide to actually make it happen.
Is workplace literacy one of the only things?
No, so we are grant funded programs for career pathways, and also we've used regional transition dollars for some of those workplace programs. We also what did I say? Citizenship grants. We run citizenship programming, which I'll get into in my later slides as well. So really, like, that is the best way to be able to fund those programs that aren't going to necessarily be sustainable on the contact hour reimbursement. But you got to get creative too. We've applied for very kind of non-ABE centered grants to fund things like student advocacy groups, right? We want to incentivize that for students to be able to participate and give their feedback on our program. But that also is something that's very hard to pay for our general operating dollars. So looking for those outside opportunities to fund something like that are the ones, at least off the top of my head, I guess.
Thank you.
Another comment I want to bring to the forefront from the chat before we go to the next question. Clark is talking about refugee resettlement basically being halted, and then thinking about what that means as far as increasing staffing to address wait lists or not, because then, the demand might not, won't be there in the future. And so like how to handle that kind of situation is a new thing to think about for some.
Yeah, I think my own thoughts on that are I can anticipate the current demand that we're seeing to last forever. We just know traditionally it won't keep up. Um, and so how do I want to invest that staffing time that makes sense? And to me, like I don't see it being a next year issue, but I see it being in 2 or 3 years, we might see a different trend. Um, I think the anxieties around immigration, it's obviously going to affect our programs and probably already has affected our programs as far as attendance goes. But we still have wait lists and we still have full registrations. So I I guess my personal opinion is ride the wave until you can, but don't assume that it's going to be there forever. And to your point, Clark, you shouldn't be setting up your systems that are dependent on that wave continuing forever too, right? There's a certain amount of flexibility you need to leave yourself.
Thank you. Again, keep comments, questions coming in the chat, but we'll add this question. What data and information are you considering as you are budgeting and planning for next year?
Yeah. So I honestly, we mostly base our budgets off of last year's budget, right? And how the spending trends happened in that budget. And I think that really is the best way to do it. Because not only are you taking into account what the costs were this year, you're also looking at where places that you might have overspent or underspent and any adjustment that you want to make there too, right? So like what should go up, hey, we didn't spend as much as we anticipated in extended time for our teachers. Do we want to lower that next year, thinking that the way that we spend this year is also going to continue into next year too? I think that's more of the options that you have with like that wiggle room with your variable cost than anything. You still want to pay extended time, right? But guessing how much you're going to be able to pay or what the trends were previously, I think is the trick to it. I think also just like like running SID for Literacy Minnesota for a few years, SID reports are the most useful thing that you can look towards as far as how your performance is going. Most of our funding is based off those contact hours. You want to make sure you are completely aware of where your contact hours are all at all times, right? And mostly comparing that breakdown of this year to last year, because that's the most important thing when you're talking about its relationship to the state and how the state's doing. But then also looking at things like Table A in SID of seeing where your student levels are broken down. Yes, that helps with funding, but it also helps with thinking about your programming and the general trends that you want to see. And if you're trying to make class schedules or say, like, how many HSE teachers do I need compared to ELL teachers next year? That's a good way of seeing how many increases you might have seen at any given ELL or ABE level, right? I also included some other stuff in here too, and I'll fully say, like, I don't think people need to pay attention to like immigration trends or regional labor market data to be successful budget managers. But to me, I'm interested in the systems that are around my sphere, right? What are those outside systems that affect my little slice of the world? And I think like looking at those trends really helps you think, well, is this current wave of student demand going to keep up? I think also if you're talking about trying to plan out career pathway programming we know that a lot of our students want to get jobs. So where should I target any sort of support or instruction that would get them those jobs that they're looking for, or what jobs are open right now? What's the market trends? That regional labor market info is really great. It's also broken down by regions all throughout the state too. So it's not just about metro. You can see trends in any part of the state. But to me, like all of this information is helpful data to be able to set the budget, because it is an emotional thing, not only to the people affected, but to the budget managers too. Like you don't want to get into an area where you're considering cuts for your program or having to lay off people, because obviously that's real human lives that you're affecting. So if any of those decisions have to be made, they should be based off of data to take out that emotional element of it. I guess that's just my opinion, but I look to some of these things just to be able to forecast where we're going as program, where we're going as a state. At Kirsten, the demand, but we don't have money left to meet it. I mean, honestly, that's where we're at too. We have huge amount of student demand, and it's a struggle for us to be able to meet it. So I guess it's a good problem to have, but it's still a problem, right? Especially when you know that demand is directly tied into your income. Karen talking about unemployment rates too. Yeah, I mean that's another thing. Is Usually when employment is good, ABE numbers go down, right? So that's something to consider too. Yes, and I wholeheartedly agree. Referring learners to smaller consortia, that is a way to be able to spread that out. And I know the state, I was asked these questions too about how can we offer programming that will help support everybody. If somebody does have the capacity, how do we move that over to the demand? So I appreciate them trying to consider those things. Good to know, Katrina. Very good to know.
So it's already coming in. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? You can unmute and share. You can add more in the chat. And also, if there's other data or information that you consider as you plan, we'd love to hear that as well. So I'll give space for a few minutes for that. Kristen adds, specifically a lot of area business partners who would like us to offer services, especially ESL geared toward the workplace, but no money left. We've already robbed Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah, it's hard because you have kind of like these schools and you try to gear people towards those because you know you have the capacity. But I understand the desire of trying to get ESL classes, especially on site, to help with targeted populations. But it's a challenge, right? I know too. It's also a challenge to be able to staff those things too. Not a lot of people want a job where they're the only person on site, right? Usually running a one-room schoolhouse too. So those are kind of the considerations you got to make.
All right, well, we'll add our final question in the mix, and I'll let us address the comment in just a second. After this final question, we do have a couple other reflection questions and wrap up. So just a heads up. But first, let's see what Karen's writing. Another piece of data I check on is what our K-12 schedules look like. We try to mirror the Mankato K-12 schedule, and they have made changes that impact when and how long we run programs.
That's tough, Karen. That's tough when you're kind of affected by those bigger systems. So I completely understand and empathize.
All right. So what new things are you hoping and planning to fund and why? And what things are you discontinuing and why?
This was a hard one to answer because of what I said before, the funding limitations with ABE, right? I think it's, 99% of the time having sustainable funding is a great benefit, but it's really hard when you're trying to start programs from scratch because you're waiting for that reimbursement cycle to kick in to be able to pay for it. So really it is that grant money, that outside investment money too. I know programs have used, especially that are part of school districts, like reserve funds for community ed to be able to pay for new programming or new teachers to try to make it sustainable. But that's hard too, because if you put in too much outside money into the system, then you build up your budget without maybe making sure that the sustainability is there too, and then it throws things off. So that's a huge challenge. I know for us too, the uncertainty with funding at the federal level has already affected us. We've already had our USCIS citizenship grant frozen at the federal level too. So that puts it into question whether we can continue those classes, whether or not that grant's even going to be up again. I think it comes open for applications in June this year to start in October. So that's a huge question mark. And then for me personally, as a program manager, it's the question of, okay, if we don't have the grant to be able to fund it, do we want to invest in our general operating dollars to continue that programming, right? Do we find enough value in it, think there's enough need and demand there to be able to subsidize it, I guess, for lack of a better term, seeing that those classes aren't able to pay for themselves without that grant funding. That's the biggest challenge that we're seeing right now as far as future of funding or what we anticipate not possibly being there going into next fiscal year. But really, like it really is right now trying to meet the student demand as much as we possibly can, to try to use all of our resources to be able to adjust those things. A lot of it is programmatic decisions or systems that we're putting in place of like, oh, our 2-3 classes are full, but how do we adjust our registration and orientation to make sure that we're getting students in the open spots in other classes? So it's kind of a juggling act right now, trying to be flexible for trying to get students in open seats. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that to me, being a budget manager means your ultimate responsibility is to keep your program going, right? And keep it sustainable. That emotion piece, that human element side of things too is sometimes it's hard to make decisions that might affect somebody's livelihood or their job, or cuts either, to FTE or positions themselves. But at the same time, if it's to make the program sustainable and to continue on, well, if our program doesn't exist, then everybody's job is going to be gone, right? So those are the hard decisions that you have to make. But it really is for the betterment of the program and ultimately for the betterment of the students, right? What's going to be the best for them and to serve them in the best possible way. So I think that's what I got for that.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Carly has a question. I'm wondering how often you meet with the accountant, what periods of the year are key times to meet and talk through things? How important is that relationship in person?
Okay, well, so Rosa is on the other side of the wall from me right now. I talk to her pretty much every day. We have monthly overall like community ed budget meetings, but we definitely try to meet as much as possible to be able to go through some of these things. I think it can never be too early in the budgeting process. Again, like with things like salary scales that we have, at least for our program, it really is easy to forecast things, as far as your greatest costs with salaries. So you can look into that months ahead. And I know that our own district process kind of starts on the earlier end. They really have us start thinking about budgets in December, right? For a fiscal year that starts in June. But that's mostly because of their complicatedness and all the budgets that they have to go in through. But to me, that's just a benefit, is like this should be talked about right now, if not sooner, to get your plan right away. If you're waiting that long, you're probably going to be way too reactive in your thinking, and that's not where you should approach your budget. You want to be proactive about your thinking of your budget and not get too bogged down in the anxiety that it kind of brings. Um, so that's a really great point, though. I personally, I think you should make relationships with two groups of people in your organization: the accountants and the janitors. If you have good relationships with them, you got a lot of support with the things that you need to make your program run the way it should. So meet with your accountant early and often.
I like, Karen, I like your point too, that cross-training staff helps with versatility. When positions have to shift or duties have to shift because of hard decisions that have to be made. And Carly adds that the last program she was hired at, hired someone new after retirement. They didn't know anything about ABE. Yes. And you realize how much background information there needs to be for that.
The
For
accountant role.
the accountant role. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I've probably, like, I know just being within a K-12 setting and right, and all the finance and stuff is set up for K-12 funding. We're always that kind of sore thumb that sticks out, that doesn't fit in with everything too. So I feel like I've had the conversation about how the contact hour reimbursement works with maybe 4 or 5 different people in finance, just re-explaining the same thing. Like, no, this is how we operate. This is when our funding comes in. We're not going to have the actual rate until August, so that's why we need to make contract adjustments. Because this was our first best guess. We didn't know the actual amount until after the fiscal year started. All that stuff.
What other comments, questions do you have? And maybe you want to add things. What new things are you planning? What are you discontinuing? Any other ideas you want to share?
I have a couple things about letting things go. We have talked about that at our district leadership level, that when you're constantly innovating and trying new things, you also have to be looking at what do I need to let go? What is kind of out of date or not working in our particular area? And sometimes I think people really hang on to things that maybe they do need to let go. And I'm talking about programming, but people also talked about things like beliefs, emotions around things. So we had a diploma completion program here for 20 years, and I ran that program. That's how I came into ABE. And we let that go. Actually, when I became the manager, I actually let that program go because we just weren't having as many people enrolling in it anymore. GED was going pretty well for us, and we did work with the competency-based diploma for a while and had some success, but people stopped enrolling in both of those programs, the credit-based and the competency-based. And I think COVID was part of the reason that happened, but we let those go and we only have GED. We didn't take on high set. And another thing to think about too is like when we work regionally now, Mankato used to do everything. And now I'm thinking to myself, Mankato cannot do everything and we don't need to do everything. We're going to do what we can do, and some things we can't afford to do. And we can refer to our regional partners who can do some of that work. We can partner with them. Last year, our GED evening program, I about was ready to cut it. We were getting no people enrolling in evening. And I was feeling guilty about having a teacher sit here every 2 nights a week and hardly anybody showing up. And then we just started talking regionally about that problem, and we came up with a regional GED model that's online. So now we can serve all of the people in Southwest Minnesota in the evening through the regional GED. And we can all put in less time and staffing for that if we share that cost, and maybe have 8 to 10 people showing up every night region wide. So thanks to the regional partnership we have, we solved that issue and didn't have to all cut our evening GED programs. But we just realized we can't all do everything. Some things we need to refer to each other. Some things we just need to say, Mankato just doesn't do that. And that can be hard to say because you want to serve everybody and you want to do everything, but you just don't have the money to do it.
But you found that solution, right? Like you said, hey, this is important. We need to do it. How can we figure this out another way? Because us recreating all the same programs just doesn't make sense. So when I heard about that at the managers meeting back in the fall, I thought that was an amazing idea, right? So kudos to you and the rest of the Southwest people of making that happen because you're still trying to meet that demand, right? You're still trying to give the students what they need. So that's awesome.
Thank you, Kevin and everyone for sharing. I am gonna move us along, but that doesn't mean that you can't keep adding things in the chat. We are watching it, so thank you for your ideas and questions. I am gonna let Kevin talk a little bit about something else that we can do.
Yeah, so it's kind of been mentioned before too, but I wanted to mention this too, as far as like budgeting can sometimes feel hopeless, right? That you're like set in a very very hard system that you can't necessarily affect. But you know, Jodi talked about in previous slides about efforts to change the statutes within the state to be able to increase funding or increase some of the systems around funding. So I also wanted to give another shout out to Literacy Action Network in their efforts to do this. Just like with Karen Walters, I'm part of the legislative committee for LAN. And so I wanted to remind people that our effort right now, the legislative platform that they're putting forth, and that's trying to get a committee meeting for, is that 10 million across the board increase to ABE funding, which I know with all of the weirdness in the State House this year, there was some questions whether or not people would even listen to us, right? Whether anything was going to get done. But I was kind of surprised to hear in our meetings that we were really moving forward with it too, and that we were getting some response from the legislators too. So that's really good and it's hopeful. And we know there is precedence of being able to get that increased funding, some of those statutes changed to be able to better serve our communities. So I know there's a link in the chat about the $10 million platform that we're posting there too. If anybody's interested in getting involved with that work, I'm sure at a certain point, once it becomes a bill and is getting close to a vote, we'll ask people to reach out to their legislators. But if you're interested in getting involved in any way, there's an email down there, info@literacyactionnetwork.org, because really the reason behind this 10 million is that we all kind of get a benefit with that, and those rising costs and our ability to serve our community gets easier across the board with that kind of increase. So yeah, please reach out and get involved if you would like to. It's a very hopeful effort. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kevin. So, Kristen has a question for you, Kevin. Or maybe Jodi.
Yeah, I can take that one. So yeah, good question, Kirsten. If this effort is successful and state statute changes, what it means is an increase in the entire pot statewide. So currently it's about 50 million. It would increase it to about 60 million roughly. So it just means that we run the formula the same way as always. It's just a bigger starting point. So bottom line, it means a bigger award for each consortium. And of course, the formula is still math, so it doesn't mean exactly the same amount of increase for everybody, but it does mean across the board more an increase for each consortium.
Thank you. So I definitely want to hear something that resonated with you from our conversation today, something that maybe has energized you regarding your upcoming budget and planning. And then I do have a poll that I need to ask for your input on. So if you're able to stick around, please do. We might end before 2:30, but I do have that coming up. So is anybody willing to share something that resonated with you or energized you today? in the chat or feel free to unmute. Yes, regional GED programming solves a lot of problems. I've also been very impressed hearing about that as well. Yes, this has been eye-opening for Christine and myself, right? We have never been a program director or program directors. Budget manager's responsibility is to keep the program sustainable. That's a good takeaway. Partnerships are key for making a small budget stretch as far as possible. Yes. I love that, Clark. It can be so validating to be like, I'm not alone, right? Even veterans are having these wonderings and conversations. I totally agree. It makes, I feel in any situation like that, it makes it asking questions feel more approachable too, right? We're all in this, no matter how long we've been doing it, there's always questions that we're thinking about and pondering, and it can be hard. There are constant shifts in budgeting. Don't be afraid to refer students on a wait list to a neighboring ABE program. Budget planning should be based on data, not emotions, which is so difficult. Grateful that we have listening ears. These are great takeaways. Oh my word. I am so glad. Please keep them coming if you are typing. Just a couple things to wrap up here. We do have an ongoing, regularly updated is what I mean, announcement doc. So the link in the slides and the link in the chat is to our website so that we all get used to going to our website. But then at the very top in the banner, there's a link to this dynamic Google Doc. And so Atlas staff is regularly updating this. So you'll see that February 26th, the admin webinar, I'll be taking that off after today. But then coming up, the One Room Schoolhouse Community of Practice, the statewide virtual conference on the 11th, the South Regional May 2nd, and there's an administrator networking meeting that's tentative, in-person details forthcoming, but just kind of events to keep on your radar, as well as links to ongoing professional opportunities, our Canvas courses, the statewide mentorship experience. The next cohort will be September. We currently have, we just began a cohort of 24 folks, 12 matches, mentors and mentees. And so definitely think about that if you are hiring new staff, that will be available in September to match with someone. We would love to receive applications, and we receive those on an ongoing basis. So yeah, just some quick links, please check this out. And another thing is, here is a survey that if you've already done this, thank you. We sent this link out during the web chat a couple weeks ago, but if you have not responded, we would love your input. So we've received several responses, but we want to make sure that anybody in this room isn't missing. So we are in the works of trying to plan a manager retreat, and what that would look like, and the logistics behind it, the location, just getting some data around how would we best serve you, because it has been a regular request to just have more FaceTime with other admins, with other managers that are involved in the same kinds of responsibilities, budgeting, supervising staff, etc. So we want your input. I'm also going to, this is where the poll that I was talking about is going to happen. I'm going to put a yes or no poll up. So the current data suggests that a day-long in-person retreat is what is desired. For the majority. Okay, so if more data comes in and that changes, okay, but currently that's what is desired. So our poll and our question to you is, looking ahead to this coming year, would you travel to the metro in late February for a day-long retreat. Okay, so aside from like a huge snowstorm, right? So if there's not unusual weather in February, would you come for a day-long retreat? And this will help us nail down a date. So there are currently so many things already scheduled. So we're trying to figure out a time that we could have this. So I see some more folks have yet to respond. So if you do see the poll on your screen, we would love to have your input on if you would travel to the metro. And I know it's hard to answer about February right now, but just typically, would that be something you would do? All right, give another minute and then this is helpful. Okay, and I need to compare this data with like the participants that are responding. We are going to be asking this question again to another group as well, but it looks like overwhelmingly people are saying yes, not unanimously, but overwhelmingly. And so, but it could be all Metro people. I need to check the attendee list. But thank you for that input. And I think that is it. I just want to say that you will receive a follow-up email from Atlas with the PDF of the slides, the recording of the webinar, and then in the evaluation, you will have CEUs embedded. So just make sure that you download those evaluation or those CEUs after you complete the evaluation. But that you can expect that for sure by next week. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Cabin. Thank you, Jodi. Thank you to everyone who participated. Thank you, Carly and Christine, for helping behind the scenes. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.